Hey viewers, today we're going to take a look at event handling in VBA. So code that's executed in response to user action or a system occurrence. So for example, changing a cell, a drop down, or perhaps clicking a button. So the action is the event and the code that gets triggered is the handler. So in Excel, we have events at workbook level, worksheet level, and even at control level. So buttons, checkboxes, things like that. And I'll be going through each one of those in this video. So let's start off with workbook level events. We'll head over to the macro editor. What we want to do is double click on this workbook. I have some code in here, but I'll just remove it so you can see what's there by default. Select workbook from this drop down, and by default it will insert the workbook open event. Right? So any code that you put in here will be executed whenever the workbook is open. You can see other events that are applicable to the workbook by coming over to the drop down on the right. Now, in my experience, the open event is the one that's used most commonly. There's also things such as before close or before save. There are other ones that I have used quite frequently. But I'm not going to go through all of them. There's too many. So I'm just going to focus on the open event. Now, since this event is triggered whenever the workbook opens, this is your chance to initialize or set defaults and so on before the user gets to interact with the workbook. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples of things you might want to do here. For example, you might want to set a default worksheet and cell that has focus whenever the workbook opens. Now, before you do that, check with the user because in most cases, they prefer to open wherever they left off. So here, I'm just selecting the input worksheet. I'm using what's called the code name for a worksheet. And I do have another video, how to reference worksheets, where I discuss this in detail, including the benefits of using the code name instead of the traditional worksheets and the sheet name. Okay, but you can use this if you prefer. So select the sheet, and then I'm going to select the default cell. Now you may want to specify the cell address directly. I don't like to hard code them in my main code. I do use other methods. So please check out my how to reference ranges for different approaches and advantages of each. Now you may want to warn the user if calculations are not enabled. In this case, if application.calculation is not equal to Excel calculation automatic, then pop up a message box asking if they want to enable them. Yes and no button on the message box, and VB question is the question mark icon that will appear. If the user selects yes, then set the calculation to automatic. Another thing you may want to do is ensure that any protected worksheets are in fact protected. So it may happen that you unprotect a worksheet, make some changes, and then distribute the workbook, only you forgot to reprotect it. So by reprotecting it here on the workbook open, it ensures the worksheets are protected before the user can actually do anything with them. Now, I'm not going to go into detail into this protect sheet subroutine, which I've created here. I do have another video called how to protect worksheets in VBA, so please check that out if you haven't already. Many applications, including Excel, have what is known as a dirty flag, and that is whenever you make a change, it sets the flag to true. So whenever you exit the application, it asks you whether you want to save or not. So depending on what you do in this open event, it may set the dirty flag to true. So if the user opens the workbook, just looks around, doesn't make any changes, and then exits the workbook, they will be prompted to save, and it could be a little confusing for them. So we can disable that by clearing the dirty flag. So this workbook.saved equals to true. Now in this case, selecting the sheet and the default cell, or even changing the calculation setting, is not going to trip that dirty flag. However, protecting worksheets will. And I'll give you a demonstration. All right, so let's not clear the dirty flag. I'll just save it and exit the workbook. Okay, back in the workbook, I haven't changed anything, haven't selected anything, it just has opened. Now I'm going to try and close the workbook, and I'll be prompted with the save, yes, no, cancel. So this can be a little confusing if you see that and you haven't done anything. So I'm going to put this back and repeat. Close the workbook. Reopen the workbook. Haven't done anything. All right. I could even click on different cells. I haven't made any changes. I can do this. Close the workbook, and there is no prompt to save. So that's with clearing the dirty flag. So if you find that any of your code in the workbook open is triggering the prompt and you don't want that, then clear the dirty flag at the very end. So next we're going to move on to worksheet level event handling. So with worksheets, events are raised, or also known as triggered or fired, at the worksheet level. So it's specific to the worksheet that you're on. So for example, if we change the cell value or change the drop-down selection, click on a button or a checkbox and so on, it's going to raise the event for this worksheet. In this case, it's the input. So for my example, what I'm going to do is some handling of the student drop-down box over here. So in particular, what I'm going to do is, if this is cleared, it's going to pop up a message saying that the student cannot be blank. The other thing I want to do is, if I change the student, it's going to ask you if you want to clear the existing input. The third thing I'm going to do is, if the change is the same student, it's not going to do anything. All right, so let's take a look at the code. The worksheet events are at the worksheet level specific to that worksheet. So find your worksheet, double click on it. Now here is my code that I've already created, but I'll just remove it so you can see the default. Just like the workbook, you want to come up to the top here and select worksheet. Now this default one that it inserts, selection change, is not a change in the value of a cell, it's just selection. So every time I click on a different cell or row, columns, and so on, it's going to trigger or raise that selection change event. And I can show you this happening. I'll put a breakpoint. If you're not familiar with this, it's part of the debugging tool. I do have a video on how to use a debugger. Please check it out if you haven't already. It's a very useful tool, not just for troubleshooting. It helps you validate your code as you're building it out. You can just step through it and see that it's doing what you want it to do. And it's also a very good tool for learning. All right, so the code is going to pause on this line. So every time I click on the cell, you can see it stopped here. So F5 will just let it run through. I can pick a column and it will trigger that event as well. Okay, F5 will just let it run through. I'm going to put my code back just so we can go through it. So what we want is the worksheet change event. This is where you can handle changes to cell values, selections, and so on. Okay. And you can find that event over on the right. So you pick worksheet on the left and then the event you want on the right. Now, since the events are at worksheet level, we need a way to determine which cell or groups of cells, rows or columns triggered the event. And the way we do that is by interrogating this target range. So we'll just skip over these few lines of code. I'll come back to this enable events later. So the way we know which cell, groups of cells and so on was modified, we use this intersect function. So it's going to look for an intersection between the target and the student dropdown. Okay, again, this is my particular way of referring to ranges. This could have just been this. So essentially, we come back to here. If this is changed here, one of these cells are changed, do they intersect with this? No. If this was changed, do they intersect with the student dropdown? Yes, but the student dropdown didn't necessarily change. If the target is this whole row, again, it does intersect with the dropdown, but that's not what changed. And I'll explain that in a moment. So we're going to do intersect target with the student dropdown. Now, if there is no intersection, it's just going to drop through the entire code. It's going to skip over everything. If there is an intersect, what we need to do is determine if the target is only one cell. And if it is, then we know it's the cell that we're interested in. Again, as I mentioned, if the target is this entire column, the number of cells is more than one. So the change wasn't to this dropdown. So as an example, I'm just going to put a breakpoint here so you can see it. And I'm going to delete this row. So at the moment, the dropdown doesn't intersect with that. But once I delete the row, the dropdown will move up and it will intersect with the row that was deleted. Delete the row. And if you come down to here, so Control G will give you this thing called immediate window. And I'll talk about that in the debugging video. So please check that out. So I can type in print target.address. So the target is row 2. Does that have an intersection with the dropdown? Well, it does now because the dropdown has moved up. So if I press F8, which just executes that one line, it does come into this bit of code. And this is the crucial bit. Target.cells.count equals 1. If it is, then we know it's the student dropdown. In this case, well, it's a whole row. So it's just going to skip over this entire bit of code and exit. Now let me just undo that. And here we go. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is, if it is just this cell, the first thing I want to check is it blank? All right, so I'm going to just press delete. All right, there will be an intersect. F8 just executes one line at a time, and the target cells count is 1. And actually, if you hover over it, you can see the value. Let's see if I can zoom in. All right, or you could just type that down here as well. Target.cells.count. Enter, and it tells me it's 1. All right, so it should fall into this bit of code. So F8. All right, so is the target value empty? So a null string. Yes, in this case. So message box, student cannot be blank, OK button, and an exclamation mark for the message box. All right. The student cannot be blank. I'll click OK. Now, because I don't want it to be blank, I'm going to do this application.undo. It's going to put it back to whatever the selection was before. All right, and then select the cell. So we're back to Steve. So he can't be blank. Now, the next thing I'm going to check is whether the student has changed. And if it is, I'm going to pop up a message box asking the user if they want to clear the inputs. So we're picking a different student. There is an intersect. There's only one cell. Again, F8, it's not empty, it's not blank. In order to know if the student has changed, I need to get the previous student and the currently selected one. So new student is the target.value. To get the previous one, I need to do application.undo. So if we go back to Excel, it's currently Nancy. If I press F8, it will put it back to Steve. Let's come back here. Now the target value will have Steve. I can store that in a different variable. So if the new student is not equal to the previous student, all right, in this case, that's true. They're not equal. Come back to here. I'm going to restore the new selection into the target value. All right, so we're back to Nancy. And then clear the inputs. Now, I'm not going to go into that subroutine. You might have different requirements for what happens when the drop-down changes. This is just to give you an example. So if I just do Shift F8, that will run that whole line and ask me if I want to, do I want to clear the inputs? I'm going to say no in this case. And then F8 just does one line at a time and go out. Right. Now I'll just show you quickly what happens if I pick Nancy again. All right. Again, the intersect, there is one. There's only one cell. It's not empty. Again, store the current selection. So new student is obviously Nancy. I pick the same one. Undo. The previous one was Nancy, so it's back to that. So store that in the previous. And now new is equal to previous. And so this line, this bit of code here is not going to be executed. It's not going to ask me to clear the input. So F8 again to step through it. Good. So that's how we handle that situation. Now, one thing that's very important, especially on these change events, is this is raised whenever you make a change. So whenever in my code here, if I do an application undo, it's changing the worksheet. If I set the target, as I do here, target value equals new student, it's going to change the worksheet. So what's going to happen, it's going to keep triggering this change event. So you end up in a loop. Right. So I'll show you this happening by commenting out this. This here, application.enableEvents equals false, prevents any other events from being raised while this code is running. All right. So I'm going to comment this out. And so enable events is true, which means you can raise other events within this one. In this case, I don't want that, but I just want to show you what happens. So I will just do a delete. All right. There's an intersect. There's only one cell. Is it blank? Yes. Student cannot be blank. That's fine. Click OK. Now this undo is going to restore the student, but it's also going to trigger the event. So you'll see it's going to come back up here instead of coming down to target.select. So F8 will run application undo. There we go. We go back into the change. It did undo. It's put back to Nancy, and we're going to come back in. All right. Now it's not null because it's put Nancy back. It's going to come here and do this next bit of code. So F8 is going to do an undo again. So it's going to raise that event again. So as you can see, we're just going round and round and round, and eventually it will probably crash. So I'm just going to come down to here and exit out of this recursive loop. So the way to avoid that is by disabling events at the very beginning by doing application.enableEvents equals false. But you need to make sure to re-enable it at the very end by setting it to true, because otherwise future events won't be fired. Now, if your code in between the disabling and re-enabling fails for some reason, then the events will remain disabled. Now, if you exit the workbook and come back in, it will reset. Otherwise, you can manually come down into this immediate window and type in application.enableEvents equals true, hit enter, and it will re-enable them for you. Ideally, what you want to do, however, is put this code here inside an error handler, and that way it will always run whether there is an error or not. And I'll talk about error handling in my other videos, so please check them out if you haven't already. Now, another thing I want to show you is something specific to the double click event and some of the other events. So by default, whenever you double click a cell, it will go into edit mode. So as you can see here, it goes inside the cell. Right? If you want to prevent that, so for example, let's say double clicking on the header sorts the data by the header that you've double clicked on. Now, when that happens, you don't want it to go into the cell, you just want it to run the code. Right, now let me just remove that breakpoint. What we're going to do is handle this before double click on the worksheet. Right. And what I'm going to do is prevent any double clicking on this cell from entering the edit mode. And that is very simply done by setting this cancel equal to true. So what I've got here again is an intersect with the target. If the target, whatever you double clicked, in this case is if it's any of the cells within the marks, so any of these ones, okay, if you double click on any of them, if that is true, so there is an intersection, it's going to check if there's only one cell like we did before, and if that's the case, prevent the double click from entering edit. Right. So double click and nothing happens. See? I cannot get in there. I can still edit, I can still change this, not a problem. I just can't double click. Whereas these ones I can double click. If you don't want to allow double click in anywhere in that worksheet, just do that. All right, and that will prevent you double clicking anything. Again, if you want a specific thing to be handled, so you only want perhaps you don't want any of these to be double clicked, then you specify that in the intersect. So we've looked at workbook and worksheet events. Let's take a look at control specific events. We're going to start off with these shapes. Now these are inserted via the insert menu, shape, and then you select whichever shape you want. Mine is a rectangle with rounded corners. Now these shapes really only have one type of event, and it's the click event. And it's not even an explicit one, it's the assign macro, which you're probably familiar with anyway. So we do assign macro. I've already got one assigned. If you wanted to create a new one, clear marks or something like that, and then new, and it creates the subroutine stub for you. Now what you'll see with shapes is there is no actual shape object up here as there was with the workbook and the worksheet. So you're pretty much limited to the on-click event. Now you can also insert form controls, and they're accessed via the developer menu. And if you don't have that, right click on the ribbon, select customize, and then over here on the right, tick the developer checkbox and then OK. Once you've got that, you can come over to this insert here, click insert, and you'll see there's a whole lot of form controls. There's a checkbox and so on. Here is a button. We're going to insert one of these buttons. And by default, as you can see, it pops up the assign macro just as it did for the shape. So again, we're going to call, we can go clear marks form, right, and then new. Just like it did with the shape, it creates a stub for you. And likewise, there is no form control object up here. So you're limited just to that click event. So if you want to do a bit more, then you're going to need the ActiveX controls. And they're accessed again via developer, insert, and then below the form controls are ActiveX controls. And they have similar controls. There's the radio button, check boxes, and also a button. Right, so we're going to add an ActiveX button. And this one, it gives you a lot more that you can do. I don't use this that often, but you may have different needs. So you can look at different properties. I'm not going to go into detail here. You can change the name of the button, again, up over here. All right, just like you did with the name ranges, or you can change the names of shapes and so on. You can give it a name, whatever you like to call it. I'm just going to leave it at default. However, if you want to look at the events, if you go to view code, so let's have a look at view code, click on that, and it will take us into here, and it creates this stub called command button 1 click. So this is the name of the control. If you renamed it, it would have prefixed it here, underscore click. Now the difference between the shape, the form control button, and this one is if you now look in the drop down up the top, you can see we have command button 1. All right. So similarly with the worksheet and the workbook, you can then select different events that you may want to handle with that button. So this gives you a lot more things you can do with it. Now you may find with these ActiveX controls that when you click on them, it doesn't do anything. So let's go and add some code and I'll show you what I mean. So let's go message box, hi from ActiveX button, all right? Just simple message, all right? And come back to here, now click on it and nothing happens. Why isn't it clicking the button? If you come up to the top in developer, up to the menu, developer, and you can see this design mode has been selected. Just uncheck that and now the click should work. There we go. Hi from ActiveX button. Well, that's all for event handling. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on future videos. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.